Hello, and welcome to Stories at Night. Imagine you arrive at night in the Latin Quarter and the city breathes around you. Lamps spill honeyed light on wet cobbles, the Seine whispers under invisible bridges, and somewhere beneath your feet, an older river keeps a secret it refuses to speak aloud. You can feel, like a low murmur through the soles of your shoes, the city's many strata settling into one another. A Roman road, a medieval wall, a modern subway tunnel, stacked like pages of a book someone else wrote. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, I will take you beneath Paris, not the Paris of pastry and boulevards, but the Paris that the Romans called Lutetia. Its baths, its amphitheater, its long hidden aqueducts, the civic skeleton whose bones were reused and recomposed for a millennium. Across 2 millennia, we will follow stone and inscription, trench and trickle, and ask why a metropolis built its new stories over old ruins and what those subsurface lives tell us about power, climate, commerce, and the stubborn persistence of place. Now, picture this. You stand on Rue Saint-Jacques, late afternoon light thin and blue across the facades, and your hand rests on a lintel whose weathered edge was dressed by Roman masons 2,000 years ago. The air tastes faintly of river silt and roast chestnuts. A dog barks, a tram passes. Below your feet, in a cut where a workman once broke ground for a new pipe, there is a carved stone face half hidden in mortar. It had been repurposed centuries ago as fill and now returns to the light as if waking from a long sleep. On a macro scale, Lutetia rose under Roman rule in the late Republic and early Empire, anchored along the Seine and clustered on the left bank, where higher ground offered safety from floods. The Forum stood around what is now Boulevard Saint-Michel. The Cardo and Decumanus intersected near the modern addresses around 172 to 174 Rue Saint-Jacques, and monumental public architecture left footprints that survive in odd places. The Arène des Lutetia was constructed in the 1st century AD as a major public venue, and the thermal complex that later became the Musée de Cluny was built around the beginning of the 3rd century. To give this a human face, follow 3 threads. First, Théodore Vaquet, a mid-19th century worker engineer who, while cutting Rue Monge during Haussmann's renovations, accidentally exposed the outer facade of a vast amphitheater in 1869. His find led to a preservation campaign spearheaded by figures such as Victor Hugo and the Société des Amis des Arènes, and a municipal decision to restore and open the site by 1896. That civic intervention is why you can sit on those stones and imagine gladiators and orators. Second, Lucius, not a single man but an archetype, the Nautè of the Seine, riverboat owners and traders who financed a votive monument we now call the Piliers des Nautes. Dressed limestone blocks carved in the early 1st century bear an inscription dedicating the monument in honor of Jupiter and the Emperor. The reliefs astonishingly combine Roman gods with indigenous Celtic deities such as Cernunnos and Tarvos Kougeranus. This is one of the earliest pieces of representational Gallo-Roman art in Gaul, and it was found reused in city walls and later recovered under Notre Dame. Third, Eugene Belgrand and his 19th century successors, municipal engineers who mapped and reconstructed Paris's water and sewer systems, and in doing so, repeatedly stumbled on Roman hydraulics. These 19th century campaigns, Belgrand is both a historical actor and a symbol of 19th century municipal modernity, reconnected modern Paris to ancient conduits. Belgrand's work on the Vannes Aqueduct and on the Masserie Reservoir tempered a civic imagination that both revealed and conserved Roman remains. Now slow down. Imagine dust in a trench, the smell of lime mortar, the crisp sleet of pottery shards. The Thermes de Cluny are not an abstract museum label, but a vaulted frigidarium that rises like a stone lung, a 14-meter-high vault where the air once steamed and voices echoed. The The consoles that hold ribs of that vault are carved in crude ship prow shapes, a small, nearly invisible signature that ties a public bath to river life and to the guilds who administered river traffic and trade. The archaeological architecture gives us measurements and materials, and through them, stories. The arene stage was long and ritualized, tiered seating wrapped around much of the arena. Beneath the stands were service rooms and cages where animals were kept. Estimates place the amphitheater's capacity in the mid-thousands. Scholars commonly suggest between 10,000 and 15,000 seats, meaning it served as a major civic theater for a provincial capital. Take the aqueduct. It once brought water roughly 26 kilometers from sources south of the city, rising and falling under gravity alone with a constant and careful slope. Much of it ran underground, only emerging above ground to bridge valleys such as the Bièvre, and its daily capacity is estimated in the low thousands of cubic meters, enough to service baths, latrines, fountains, and private cisterns. Remarkably, 19th and 20th century engineers rediscovered fragments of its basin and conduit during city works, studied them, and then sometimes reburied them to permit continued urban modernization. Now follow the people. Émilie, a municipal clerk in the 1870s, writes a letter that eventually reaches Victor Hugo. She describes skeletal remains and carved capitals, and her voice helps galvanize a preservation movement. Lucius, the Naute Guild leader, signs a dedication on limestone with careful Roman epigraphy and tacit Gaulish motifs. Centuries later, a priest finds those same blocks repurposed in a wall and thinks little of them until antiquarians recognize their value. Hélène, a 20th century engineer, opens a manhole and sees a Roman conduit laid in Roman concrete. She photographs it, notes the precise gradient, and files her report in a municipal archive where it waits to be compared with more recent finds. These individual acts, a letter, a carving, a photograph, become the threads archaeologists weave into narrative. Evidence alley, archaeology depends on material traces. The Pillar of the Boatman gives us a dated inscription that mentions Tiberius, R.A.D. 14-37, which anchors one civic act to the early 1st century. The Therme de Cluny's masonry and mosaics, the pilaster fragments reused in medieval buildings, the amphitheater's podium and niches, the lead pipe stamps, these are all empirical clues. Dendrochronology and radiocarbon dates from organic fills, stratigraphic observations from excavations by Jean-Louis Capitan and later teams in the 1910s and beyond, and 19th century engineers' reports together form a dense paper trail. The 19th century rediscovery of the arenes during Haussmann works, the 1710 recovery of parts of the Pillar of the Boatman beneath Notre Dame, and the 19th and early 20th century investigations into sections of the aqueduct all provide cross-validation between archival and material records. Here are 3 little-known or counterintuitive facts that often surprise even well-read visitors. First, the Pillar of the Boatman, though a Roman civic dedication, deliberately depicts and names Celtic deities alongside Roman ones, a public statement of hybrid identity, not simple assimilation. Second, the Thermes de Cluny's architectural consoles are carved to resemble ship prows, which suggests a direct sponsorship or involvement by the river guilds in the bath's construction and use, linking bath culture to river commerce. Third, large portions of the Roman aqueduct were rediscovered in modern times, but were often recovered by city engineers to preserve urban continuity. 19th century modernization both exposed and concealed the ancient infrastructure. That paradox, discovery followed by reburial, makes the Roman legacy both visible and curiously hidden in modern Paris. Tension and competing theories. Some scholars emphasize abrupt breakdown. The barbarian incursions and the crisis of the 3rd century, mid-200s AD, forced defensive contraction onto the Ile de la Cité and led to depopulation of the left bank. Archaeological signs of rubble, sudden reuse, and reinforced island fortifications seem to support episodes of violent disruption. Others, however, argue for continuity and adaptive reorganization. Economic shifts, administrative centralization, and evolving Christian institutions produced a slow knitting down of urban spaces rather than a single cataclysm. Some scholars argue the aqueduct and baths were abandoned from sudden violence.
Others point to coinage and burial continuity into the 4th century as evidence of endurance. The strongest evidence currently favors a complex combination. Acute episodes of violence accelerated longer-term structural changes because the key data point is stratigraphic continuity of certain domestic levels in coin circulation that persist after attacks, indicating adaptation rather than total collapse.
Listen to the city's quieter evidence, coin hoards that continue into later centuries, medieval documents that remember the Clos des Arènes, even when the monument lay buried. The archaeologists carefully recorded stratigraphy showing repeated use and reuse. These tell us that cities are not created once and then lost, but are continuously remade, each layer informing the next. The visible fragments, a carved face, a reused column, a patch of Roman pavement under modern asphalt, are the trace elements of that long conversation. If you've walked these streets, tell me in the comments which discoverable fragment surprised you most: the Pillar of the Boatman, the Frigidarium's vault, the amphitheater's tiered stones, or the buried aqueduct. Share a detail, a question, or a photograph if you have one. I read every comment. Thank you for staying with me beneath the city. If you enjoyed this excavation of memory and infrastructure, like and subscribe for more stories that turn stones into voices. Before we continue with our story today, leave a comment with the fragment that caught your breath. If you liked the descent, like and subscribe for more walks into the layers of cities. I read each of your notes, and sometimes I turn them into episodes. Now we continue. You linger in the quiet after the outro, as though the narrative hasn't released you yet, as though the stones themselves insist on one more story. Night in Paris has a way of keeping hold of you like that. Its river smell, its low hum, the knowledge that beneath every footstep lie 2,000 years of compromise and reinvention. And so, instead of heading upstairs to the bright modern world, you follow a narrow corridor of the mind, a secondary descent into the deeper, less polished strata of Lutetia's hidden life. Now, imagine a breath of cold air rising through a crack in the floor. It smells of clay, iron, wet stone, the undernote of an ancient city that never entirely dries out. You lower yourself through an imagined hatch into a lightless cavity. This is not a museum, not a curated ruin, but something more primal, earth claiming what was once architecture. Your fingertips trace the contour of an ashlar block. It vibrates faintly with the rush of the metro somewhere above, but beneath that mechanical tremor, you feel something more delicate, the faintest echo of human hands that cut, placed, and aligned these stones in the first centuries of our era. Now let the walls around you materialize, rough mortared rubble at first, but then a single course of Roman opus vitatum, alternating bands of stone and brick, the Roman signature of stability. It emerges from darkness the way a memory emerges from sleep. These are not the well-known walls of the Cluny baths, nor the dramatic sweep of the Arenes. These belong to a lesser-known quarter, once called the Insula dei Negociatores, the Island of Merchants, located near the riverbank where Rue de la Boucherie now runs. Archaeological trenches in the 1960s, rare, quiet, almost accidental, revealed burnt layers and domestic pottery dating between the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, showing that this neighborhood was dense with small shops and storage rooms before later floods and medieval leveling erased the surface. You picture the merchants, one selling dyed wool from Lugdunum, another grinding imported pepper from India's Malabar coast. Black peppercorns have been carbonized in Roman contexts across Gaul, a sharp reminder of a global economy long before the term existed. Now look low, near the earth, a cluster of amphora shirts. Some are the familiar Gaulish type, pale orange with thickened rims, but one lying half submerged in silt bears a faint rim stamp from Baetica, southern Spain, indicating olive oil trade across the western Mediterranean. Another carries traces of pitch and wine resin from Campania. Trade was not an ornament of Roman Lutetia, but a lifeline. For a settlement that began as a Celtic crossing, the Seine was the spinal cord that connected Lutetia to the empire's inner organs, its markets, its ports, its tastes, its taxes.
Now listen, you hear a rhythmic drip of water. Follow it through the dark until the air cools and narrows. You are approaching one of the lesser-known Roman drainage channels, discovered only because 20th century workers repairing a modern sewer cracked into it by accident. The report, filed to the city archives in 1935, describes a conduit of Roman mortar and rubble construction, 1.3 meters high, showing wear consistent with long-term water flow. Few people ever read that report. Fewer still visited the cavity before it was sealed again. But the record remains, a hidden footnote in the city's biography. This drain, modest and unremarkable compared to the grand aqueducts, tells a small but vital truth. Roman cities were shaped as much by the infrastructure of waste as by the infrastructure of spectacle. Sewers, not amphitheaters, determined health, longevity, and municipal stability. The drainage channels that carried runoff and household waste toward the Seine formed a web of careful gradients that required constant maintenance. When maintenance faltered, water pooled, walls weakened, malaria gained foothold, and entire quarters entered decline. You feel the ghost of that engineering beneath your hand as you touch the sloped mortar bed. It is smooth, almost glossy. Centuries of flow buffed it like river limestone. Now, shift your imaginary torch and notice what glints in its weak beam. A piece of metal, small, greenish with age. A Roman tessera, a token used for entry into events, or sometimes as a receipt for goods. This one, if you look closely, bears the faint outline of a palm branch, perhaps indicating the right to attend a performance in the arenas. Thousands must have been minted, only a handful are ever found. Most dissolved into soil or were melted in medieval furnaces, but here, in the drainage of a merchant quarter, one survives. You turn it over in your hand. A cheap object in its time, now priceless, a direct, tactile thread between you and some long-lost inhabitant who carried it to a spectacle, cheered or jeered, and then dropped it on the way home. Now pull back from this single find and widen the lens again. Lutetia was not a uniform Roman plan stamped on a Celtic village. It was a negotiation. Roman surveying imposed grids, but local needs bent them. Roman public buildings stood tall, but native traditions breathed within them. The Pilier des Notes proves this hybridity. The pipes stamped with legionary marks show military presence. The coin hoards mixing imperial and provincial mints show mobility. And the amphorae pointing to Spain, Italy, even North Africa show a synaptic city, firing connections across continents. Walk a few meters further in your imagined underworld. You reach a patch of soil that feels different beneath your feet, grainier, disturbed. This is not a drainage trench nor a merchant cellar. It is a burying ground. Long before Paris expanded outward, its cemeteries clustered near the edges of Roman habitation. Excavations in the early 2000s near the modern Saint-Michel area revealed dozens of graves from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, many containing objects that complicate the neat narrative of Romanization. One burial contained a small blue glass bead from the Rhineland. Another had a knife made of local iron ore. A third held a coin of Emperor Postumus, minted during the breakaway Gallic Empire around AD 260 to 269. Proof that even when the Central Empire fractured, Lutetia participated in its rebellious Western counterpart.
Imagine kneeling beside one of those graves. The soil here is darker, richer, the texture of decomposed wood and long dissolved flesh. You brush away sediment from a ceramic lamp. It is intact, its spout burnt black from use. On its disc is a relief, very faint but visible if you tilt it, a shepherd carrying a lamb. A Roman motif, yes, but one that would later be adopted into early Christian iconography. Does this indicate a Christian buried here? Possibly, but scholars debate. The lamp style predates mass Christianization. It might simply reflect a pastoral motif popular in Gallic workshops. You weigh uncertainties, style, layering, soot, context. Archaeology rarely gives certainty. It gives patterns, possibilities, and long pauses in which you must decide which meaning seems most proportional to the evidence. As you stand, your foot brushes something else, a small copper brooch, corroded but still decorated with a swirling Latin-style pattern, pre-Roman artistry in a Roman-era grave.
This is what complicates the story. Identity was not a toggle that flipped from Gaulish to Roman one generation after conquest. It was additive. A Lutetia in the 2nd century AD may have spoken Latin in the Forum, worshipped Jupiter in Cernunnos, traded for Spanish olive oil, used imported pepper, and worn a brooch crafted in an older Celtic style, inherited from ancestors who built the oppidum at Modon. You tuck the brooch in your palm like a secret, then place it back in the soil in your mind, because some objects are best left exactly where they were found, even in imagination. Now move further west in the unseen labyrinth. The soil grows damper, the air colder. You are approaching what would have been the floodplain. The Seine in Roman times was wider, slower, and prone to seasonal swelling. Written sources from later centuries speak of catastrophic floods in 358 and again in the 6th century, but sediment cores taken near the modern Quai de la Tournelle show flood layers far older, fine gray silts banded with organic matter that date back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. These layers suggest that major floods periodically reshaped the banks, forcing urban planners to adjust foundations and redirect footpaths. This may be one reason Lutetia never expanded much onto the right bank during its Roman peak. The marshy land north of the river was simply too unstable for heavy monumental construction.
But the stones tell a different story. In 1994, during the renovation of a car park near Hotel de Ville, workers found remains of a Roman-era timber wharf extending into what would have been the river channel. Dendrochronology dated some beams to around AD 90. Timber quays like this were not mere loading platforms, they were economic lifelines, where goods, people, and information arrived. Standing here now, in your imagined excavation pit, you smell the river, real or phantom, its long memory of silt and current. You picture barges moored against the beams, low, wide vessels loaded with grain, oil, wine, perhaps even marble. The presence of this wharf suggests that the right bank was not a void in Roman times, but a logistical zone, functional, muddy, busy, if not heavily built. Now climb away from the floodplain and follow a faint incline upward toward the hill that would later host the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. In Roman times, this slope carried villas, orchards, and workshops aligned with the Decumanus. Archaeological fragments found near Rue du Cardinal Lemoine include hypocaust tiles and painted wall plaster, evidence of domestic luxury. In one dig, a fragment of fresco was discovered bearing a delicate vegetal motif, ivy tendrils painted in green and black on a white background, unmistakably Roman in style. Imagine the villa it once adorned, a dining room open to a courtyard, a fountain at its center, a mosaic floor with geometric patterns. In that mosaic, perhaps bits of glass tesserae caught the sun in blues and reds. You imagine their crunch under a boot the day the villa was abandoned. But why abandoned? Here, scholars disagree. Some argue that economic contraction in the late 2nd century caused elite households to relocate closer to the protected island, preferring security to space. Others point to the mid-3rd century crises, when the empire fractured and northern Gaul became a front line. Raiding parties from the north targeted outlying settlements. Even if Lutetia was not razed, its elites may have sensed instability and retreated. The strongest evidence for gradual abandonment is the lack of burning in many domestic ruins. No ash layers, no blackened beams. Instead, there are signs of slow decay, collapsed roofs, silty accumulations, pottery scatter consistent with long-term weathering rather than sudden flight.
Stand in one such ruin now. Feel the uneven stones underfoot, the soft crumble of plaster. Birds probably nested here long after humans left. Wind scoured the interiors. Rain dissolved pigments. By the time medieval builders quarried these stones, the villas were little more than shapeless humps in the soil. Yet their footprints remained, invisible but stubborn, influencing street alignments that survive in faint form even today. Paris is full of these ghosts, curves in roads that follow Roman property lines, odd building angles inherited from foundations 12 centuries older. Now descend again into the dark, but this time through a different kind of tunnel. Imagine a long gallery reinforced by medieval masons, because in many places, medieval cellars adopted Roman foundations wholesale. You walk along one such hybrid passage, Roman at its base, medieval above it, modern pipes cutting across it like intrusive vines. On the wall, you notice graffiti. No, not spray paint, but faint inscriptions cut into stone. Some are medieval letters, but one, barely visible, is older, LVP, possibly initials, possibly a workshop mark. It is scratched into a reused Roman block. The medieval builder who carved it may not have known that the block originally formed part of a Roman portico. This layering, unconscious reuse creates a palimpsest where identities overlap without blending. As you continue, the temperature drops again. Moisture beads on the walls. You are approaching a section of the ancient aqueduct that was breached and examined during the 1977 sewer upgrades near Parc Montsouris. The report noted impeccably applied opus caementicium and a consistent gradient of approximately 1%. Imagine placing your hand on the inside of that conduit. Roman concrete feels different from modern concrete. Denser, heavier, almost ceramic. It was made with lime, pozzolanic ash, and aggregates carefully proportioned. This particular section still bore traces of the reddish waterproof plaster called opus signianum. It's astonishing to think water flowed through here nearly 1,800 years ago, feeding baths, fountains, and private houses. You hear echoes of that flow, as though time itself still trickles along the conduit's slope. Now picture the people responsible for maintaining it. Aquarii, watermen, were civic officials tasked with inspecting conduits, controlling distribution, and reporting blockages. They carried tools similar to those of modern plumbers. Their work is mostly invisible in the archaeological record, but occasional inscriptions mention them. One fragment found near Nanterre refers to a certain Gaius Sergius Secundus, curator aquarium. Perhaps he once walked beneath Lutetia's surface, listening for leaks, measuring flows with simple rods, ensuring that bathhouse furnaces could be fed and that fountains would not run dry. You imagine him holding a torch, feeling for dampness on the walls, doing the same work you are imagining now.
Move on. The walls here narrow. You turn sideways to avoid scraping your shoulder against limestone. At the far end of this passage, you find a small opening, natural rather than architectural. A pocket of earth, darker than the rest, smelling faintly of charcoal. This is a collapse layer, the kind left when a beam rots or a ceiling gives way. Within it, archaeologists sometimes find the intimate refuse of daily life: spindle whorls, broken combs, children's toys. In one excavation near the Pantheon, a tiny clay figurine was found, an oxen-drawn wagon, roughly modeled but charming, likely a child's plaything. Imagine the child who held it, running along a Roman street where now cars idle and students carry backpacks. The figurine's broken wheel tells a story, perhaps dropped, stepped on, lost in the dust of a courtyard. It waited nearly 2 millennia to be noticed again. Now, imagine rising into a wider chamber, where the darkness grows soft and ambient. Here, as if by magic, the Roman street grid overlays itself faintly in your mind. You see the Cardo running north-south, the Decumanus east-west, intersecting roughly where Rue Saint-Jacques meets Boulevard Saint-Germain today. You walk along that invisible pavement. Shops line the way. To your left, a bakery, evidenced by carbonized grain and a broken millstone found in excavations. To your right, a workshop where antler offcuts were found, evidence of comb making. The smell here is a mixture of bread, wood smoke, wet hide. You hear the murmur of traders speaking in a mixture of Latin and Gaulish, perhaps even a smattering of Germanic tongues.
Thank you for staying in the shadows with me a while longer. We'll climb back to the surface together, one layer at a time. You feel the cold first, an unexpected coolness pressing against your skin, as though the earth itself exhales. A dim corridor stretches ahead, stone ribs curving overhead, and the muted rumble of 21st century Paris seeps through the ceiling like the distant wash of an unseen tide. Your fingertips graze a block of ancient limestone, and for an instant, the city above vanishes, replaced by a silence older than its streets. Hello and welcome to Stories at Night. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we descend beneath Paris, beneath its cafes and boulevards, beneath its hurried commuters and shimmering bridges, to the Roman city of Lutetia.
the ghost that sleeps under the capital of France. We'll trace the buried aqueducts that once fed a thriving provincial town, wander the fragments of roads swallowed by later avenues, and sift through clues that reveal how an ordinary Roman settlement became a vanished world beneath a modern metropolis. This matters because Lutetia is not just Paris's ancestor, it's a rare laboratory where urban palimpsest, archaeology, and historical imagination converge, showing us how cities never vanish, they merely rearrange their bones.
Then the 19th century arrives with a roar of demolition and renovation. Haussmann cuts boulevards through medieval lanes, unearthing Roman stones without meaning to. Belgrand's sewer works hum with modern ambition, suddenly intersecting with ancient conduits. The Arens are rediscovered. Capitan excavates them. Scholars debate how much to expose, how much to preserve, how much to sacrifice to the living city. Now return to the present, standing in your own time, but with 2,000 years layered behind your eyelids like afterimages. And when you finally emerge, imaginary ladder climbed, dust shaken off, breath steadied, you step once more into the night air of Paris. The city sounds different now. Every hum of the metro, every vibration of a scooter wheel, every echo between buildings carries the suggestion of deeper resonance, as if modern Paris is merely the last verse in a very long chant. You walk along the Seine. Its surface glints beneath bridge lights. Somewhere beneath it lie timbers from the Roman wharf. Somewhere above, Notre Dame guards the blocks of the Piliers des Notes. Somewhere to the south, the aqueduct's ghost runs beneath residential streets. Somewhere east, beneath the grassy oval of a schoolyard, the Arens keep their silence. And now settle in, let the noise of the modern world fade away. The line returns to you unbidden, not as an introduction this time, but as a reminder that noise fades only when you know how to listen through it. If this deeper descent gave you something, a question, a spark, a new way of walking the streets, leave me a comment. Tell me what you would explore next. The medieval undercrofts, the vanished monasteries, the Roman ghosts under other European cities. I read every thought you leave. Thank you for staying in the shadows with me a while longer. We'll climb back to the surface together, one layer at a time. You feel the cold first, an unexpected coolness pressing against your skin as though the earth itself exhales. A dim corridor stretches ahead, stone ribs curving overhead, and the muted rumble of 21st century Paris seeps through the ceiling like the distant wash of an unseen tide. Your fingertips graze a block of ancient limestone, and for an instant, the city above vanishes, replaced by a silence older than its streets. Hello and welcome to Stories at Night. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we descend beneath Paris, beneath its cafes and boulevards, beneath its hurried commuters and shimmering bridges, to the Roman city of Lutetia, the ghost that sleeps under the capital of France. We'll trace the buried aqueducts that once fed a thriving provincial town, wander the fragments of roads swallowed by later avenues, and sift through clues that reveal how an ordinary Roman settlement became a vanished world beneath a modern metropolis. This matters because Lutetia is not just Paris's ancestor, it's a rare laboratory where urban palimpsest, archaeology, and historical imagination converge, showing us how cities never vanish, they merely rearrange their bones. Now picture this. You stand at the edge of a narrow excavation trench along Rue Saint-Jacques, the sun settling behind the Pantheon's dome. The smell of damp soil rises from the pit where modern asphalt has been peeled back to expose a mosaic of stone surfaces. The traffic noise softens, strangely absorbed by these older layers. A fragment of paving, smooth, worn into a shallow groove by cartwheels nearly 2,000 years old, glows with an amber tint in the late light. A metro train rumbles beneath your shoes, yet the feeling that overwhelms you is not noise, but depth, as though the street has momentarily split open to show the time-stacked lives it carries. Lutetia, Lutetia Perazorium, was already standing on the Ile de la Cité when Julius Caesar described it in Commentari di Bello Gallico around 52 BCE, though the settlement then belonged to the Parisii, a Gallic tribe whose name would eventually christen an empire's future capital. By the 1st century CE, after Rome consolidated control of the region, the Romans reshaped the site into a provincial town fanning out from both banks of the Seine, aligning streets to a rational grid and erecting the infrastructure that signaled Romanization: a forum near today's Rue Saint-Jacques, baths on the left bank, and an amphitheater, the Arènes de Lutèce, where up to 15,000 spectators could gather. By around 125 CE, an aqueduct at least 26 kilometers long channeled water from the plateau near Rongius toward the growing city. Yet Lutetia remained modest, not a major imperial center like Ludonum, Lyon, but an industrial node where Roman order met Gallic memory. Let's bring a few human voices into these corridors of stone. First comes Marcus Servilius Vindex, a hypothetical but historically grounded figure modeled on dedicatory inscriptions found near the ancient baths. He served as a local magistrate around late 2nd century CE, a period when the town's prosperity peaked. His name appears, partially worn, on a limestone block discovered in 1870 during Haussmann's renovations, and one surprising detail stands out. The inscription notes his patronage of a grain measuring station, evidence that even in Roman Lutetia, grain supply was a civic obsession, revealing worries about winter scarcity that the city's mild climate rarely justified.
Then there is Aelia Prudentilla, a composite built from funerary stelae unearthed near the Rue de Vaugirard necropolis. She was likely a merchant's daughter. Her carved epitaph references textile trade symbols, and she died young, perhaps at 24. Her tomb held a glass unguentarium tinted cobalt blue, now preserved at the Musée Carnavalet. The surprising part is this: chemical analysis done by a 2016 research team from the Sorbonne identified trace components more typical of North African perfumed oils than Gallic ones, implying Lutetia had broader commercial ties than the textbooks usually granted. And finally, an intrepid eyewitness of a different kind, Theodore Vaccaire, the 19th century archaeologist who, between 1855 and 1870, documented dozens of Roman structures during the city overhaul under Baron Haussmann. It was Vaccaire who realized the modest remains near Rue Mage belonged to an amphitheater far larger than anyone assumed. Historians expected a small arena. Instead, Vaccaire uncovered curved seating stretching more than 130 meters, a discovery so startling that the press of 1869 called it the Sleeping Colosseum of Paris. And here's the odd fact: Vaccaire's private notebooks, only published in full in 2012, suggest he believed far more of the Roman city survived intact but lay unreachable beneath a new sewer system built between 1858 and 1878. Now step with me down Evidence Alley, where stone, inscription, and soil speak with eerie clarity. The Saint Marcel sector south of the Seine reveals a street grid consistent with the Cardo and Decumanus, though the alignment subtly shifts, just 7 degrees from the perfect north-south Roman standard. Archaeologists still debate why, but a 2014 geomorphological study indicates the land sloped more sharply in antiquity than present-day maps imply, forcing engineers to adapt their ideal plan. Beneath the modern Collège de France, excavators in 1994 found a cluster of workshop pits filled with shards of amphorae from Spain's Baetica region, unexpectedly high quantities, suggesting Lutetia imported more olive oil per capita than other comparable Gallic cities, such as Autun or Reims. Here's one of those little-known curiosities. Fragments of wooden writing tablets discovered near the Ile de la Cité in 2008 contained stylus scratches interpreted as school exercises. The most complete one features a line from Virgil, but written with 2 spelling errors, hinting that literacy in Lutetia, even among the educated, was a practical tool rather than a polished art. Another odd detail: beneath the Arènes de Lutèce, soil cores revealed pockets of charcoal mixed with animal bone from species not commonly eaten in Gaul, such as peacocks. This suggests elite families in the town used exotic foods for ritual banquets or displays of status, contradicting the older assumption that Lutetia was culturally provincial. But the stones tell a different story too. Radiocarbon studies of the aqueduct mortar from a 2017 CNRS study indicate multiple construction phases, including a large repair around 260 CE, precisely when the Roman Empire faced incursions and regional instability. This aligns with written accounts such as the Historia Augusta, which describe the need to fortify cities across Gaul. Some scholars argue Lutetia shrank after a fire mentioned in the late 3rd century, while others claim the decline came not from disaster, but from strategic realignment as the empire refocused on northern defenses. The strongest evidence currently favors the latter, because coin hoards, particularly one found in 2009 near Boulevard Saint-Germain, containing pieces stamped with emperors Gallienus, Claudius Gothicus, and Aurelian, cluster around 260 to 275 CE, a pattern typical of residents hiding wealth during troop movements rather than fleeing environmental catastrophe.
Now we approach the boundary of competing theories. Why did so much of Roman Lutetia disappear? Some argue the medieval rebuilding smothered the Roman town gradually, stone by stone, as churches, cloisters, and universities claimed the left bank. Others point to the frequent Seine floods recorded between 583 and 829 CE, which may have damaged Roman-era structures enough that rebuilding followed new alignments. A third school suggests a subtler cause, the growing importance of the Isle de la Cité as an administrative center under the Merovingians and Carolingians shifted attention away from Roman districts, leaving them to decay in place. Each theory holds truth, but the tipping point appears in the urban land registers of 1250, which show property divisions no longer respecting ancient street lines. When cadastral logic breaks from its past, a city has forgotten its bones. Here is the reveal. The Roman city did not vanish, it was deliberately folded into later Paris. Medieval builders quarried limestone from the abandoned baths. Cart drivers reused Roman paving stones as convenient foundations. Monastic communities dug cellars that clipped the edges of forgotten walls. In the 12th century, when Abbot Suger renovated Saint Denis using the new Gothic style, builders scavenged marble fragments from old Roman structures along the left bank, mixing imperial debris into sacred architecture. The transformation was not a single collapse, but a slow metamorphosis in which each generation reinterpreted the stones beneath its feet. The aqueduct dried, not because it failed, but because by the early Middle Ages, wells and river ports better suited the reborn city clustered around the Ile de la Cité. As Paris grew upward and outward, Lutetia became a fossil, intact in some places, crushed in others, but always present, waiting for centuries to whisper its shape back into the light. And so we come to aftermath and legacy. When 19th century workers blasted tunnels for the Metro Line 4, they struck Roman masonry beneath the Place Saint-Michel, forcing engineers to reroute sections of track, a rare moment when modern ambition had to bow to ancient presence. Today, the Arenes de Lutèce stands as both ruin and playground, echoing with the shouts of children and pétanque players, a reminder that the Roman past still breathes beneath the rhythm of Paris. When you walk the left bank, each gentle rise and fall of the pavement echoes an ancient boundary, the forum's platform, the bath's substructures, the ghost aqueduct threading toward Rangy. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. In the comments, tell me where in the world and perhaps when in history you'd travel if the layers of cities could peel back for you. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, may the old stones remember your steps as kindly as they have remembered ours. But our journey into the lost city beneath Paris is not over. The script you heard, flowing towards its natural ending, was only the surface of the world waiting below the surface of the modern streets. To reach the fullness of this long-form nocturnal exploration, we must return underground, deeper this time, guided not by narrative structure, but by the slow pulse of subterranean memory. Imagine, then, that the camera drifts back down through layers of soil, spinning through the darkness until it settles in a chamber that has not felt open air for centuries.
You stand where the Roman south bank once sloped gently toward the Seine, though the river's ancient course sat several meters lower. It is quiet here, utterly quiet, so quiet you can hear the settling of dust. A faint imprint on the floor resembles the hexagonal pattern typical of Roman hypocaust pili. Your lantern casts a trembling ring of light across the stone, revealing hollows where supporting columns once stood. Each is no wider than your forearm, yet together they once held an entire bath complex aloft, suspending floors so that hot air could migrate beneath and warm the rooms above. You kneel. Your fingers brush the edge of a broken tile. The clay is surprisingly soft, fragile as baked bread crust. In that instant, a whole vanished room seems to breathe around you. The murmur of water, the steam rising from calderia, and the distant splash of bathers gossiping in low Latin murmured across centuries. Now the narrator's voice shifts, not in tone, but in intimacy, as though drawing nearer to your ear. It explains how these hypocaust remnants were first noticed in 1890 when workers renovating the sewer system beneath Rue Gay-Lussac punctured a cavity that turned out to be the substructure of the Thames de Cluny, the largest surviving Roman baths in northern Gaul. What most textbooks omit is that the room we call the frigidarium likely functioned as a civic salon. Scrape marks on the wall plaster, analyzed by micro-excavation in 2001, reveal grooves from the backs of chairs, wooden ones, pulled repeatedly against the same stretch of stone. Roman bathhouses were not merely for bathing, they were offices, lecture halls, and gossip chambers rolled into one. The camera follows your gaze upward, mapping the soaring vaults that remain intact above street level today, yet beneath these arches lies a deeper layer seldom shown. The discarded heating bricks, collapsed flues, piles of unused tiles that hint at renovations halted mid-work. Some archaeologists argue this indicates a late 3rd century crisis interruption, repairs begun but abandoned. Yet another school suggests the opposite, that the variety of bricks points to a long tradition of patching and maintenance, the ordinary life of a city adjusting to wear, neglect, and renewed prosperity. The strongest evidence leans toward this latter reading because thermoluminescence tests on the bricks cluster around 140 to 180 CE, not the supposed crisis years. The baths were simply well used. You rise and step deeper into the dark. The floor dips slightly. Remnants of a Roman drain run beneath your shoes, its terracotta half-pipes fitted with surprising precision. You sense the presence of running water, though you hear none. The narrator explains that the original drainage of Lutetia was engineered to accommodate both storm runoff and bath outflow, but nearly every drain discovered is angled just a little off from strict alignment, an architectural quirk caused by builders adapting Roman engineering to the Gallic landscape carved by the Seine's ancient meanders. Now imagine the documentary camera cutting to a slow pan across a series of archaeological sketches drawn by a meticulous hand. Theodore Vacquier's. His pencil lines, traced under lamplight during excavations between 1860 and 1867, catch not only walls and foundations, but the subtle undulations of terrain long since leveled by Parisian urban planners. His unpublished sketch from March 1864, reproduced only in an academic monograph from 1987, shows the amphitheater's eastern portal intact beneath layers of medieval rubble. It suggests the structure was not entirely dismantled during the Middle Ages, as once taught, but simply buried by the expansion of the nearby St. Victor Abbey's gardens. The medieval monks, it seems, did not destroy the Roman past, they gardened on top of it.
But the lost city is not made purely of stones. It is made of voices, too. The narrator invites you to listen, to truly listen, because the next figure stepping from the gloom is a person whose presence is preserved only in a footnote of a Merovingian charter. Chrodebert, a monk of Saint-Germain-des-Prés around 675 CE, left a tantalizing note in a property list describing a vineyard laid upon the old walls. Scholars long puzzled over what these old walls were until excavations in 1998 revealed Roman foundations under the abbey's earliest vineyards. This small clue offers a startling fact. early medieval monastic communities intentionally planted over Roman ruins, not out of ignorance, but because the rubble provided superior drainage for vines. The monks, in effect, turned the Roman city into agricultural subsoil. The camera drifts past one last Roman-era figure, this one real, well-documented, and integral to understanding Lutetia's rhythms. Tiberius Julius Bellicus, a merchant from Autun, who left his name on a bronze weight found near the Ile de la Cité in 1872. The weight is precisely 327 grams, a curious number because it corresponds not to the Roman libra, but to a Gaelic measurement standard. This implies Lutetia maintained hybrid economic practices well into the 2nd century, a reminder that Romanization was rarely total. Instead, it was textured, negotiated, and often practical rather than ideological. Bellicus calibrated his wares to meet both Roman bureaucrats and local buyers.
Now the scene cuts to Evidence Alley once more, but deeper. Less a corridor of artifacts than a canyon of stratigraphy descending through centuries. Picture the screen splitting vertically into layers, modern asphalt, 19th century fill from Houseman's boulevards, medieval refuse pits, early medieval hearth layers, late Roman abandonment debris, and finally, the neat Roman construction horizon. One layer contains a scatter of coins minted under Tetricus I, who ruled the Gallic Empire briefly around 271 to 274 CE, a turbulent time when the region around Lutetia belonged not to Rome, but to a breakaway state. The coins are of incredibly poor quality, thin, brittle, overloaded with copper impurities. This is one of those counterintuitive facts. During the Gallic Empire's short independence, the coinage worsened even as trade networks briefly stabilized. Archaeologists interpret this as a sign of fiscal experimentation or desperation. Either way, it complicates the simplistic tale of Roman order interrupted only by barbarian chaos. Another layer below yields a small wooden object no bigger than a walnut, a child's carved playing piece, rounded like a spindle whorl, but decorated with tiny, incised geometric patterns. Found in 2011 beneath Rue Linné, it represents one of the oldest physical pieces of children's gaming equipment discovered in Paris. Its existence reminds us that Lutetia was not solely a world of officials, merchants, and soldiers. It was a city where children laughed, played, cried, and carved toys, while parents argued over grain prices and seasons turned across the Seine. The narrator pauses, briefly, reverently, because the next surprise is something even historians did not expect. A patch of soil containing pollen traces of Juglans regia, the common walnut tree, dating to around 50 BCE. This predates Roman transformation and suggests the Parisi cultivated or at least consumed walnuts before Roman contact. Since walnut trees require specific conditions to thrive, this hint of pre-Roman horticulture contradicts earlier assumptions that the Parisi lived almost exclusively by fishing and river trade. They farmed, they planted. Their world was not solely a watery frontier, but a cultivated landscape.
Now the narrative shifts again, widening beyond the archaeological trench to trace how the Roman city interacted with its environment. The Seine was not yet constrained by the quays built under the Bourbon kings. It braided through marshes, islets, and seasonal channels. Sediment cores extracted near the Jardin des Plantes in 2019 reveal alternating bands of flood silt and calm water deposits, charting centuries of shifting river patterns. One particularly thick band, dating to circa 160 CE, matches a documented period of high flooding recorded in the Annales de Lugdunum, suggesting Lutetia witnessed at least one major inundation during its height. But the evidence shows adaptation, not collapse. Subsequent construction layers include flood-resistant materials like silex-embedded concrete, proving residents fortified their infrastructure rather than abandoning the flood-prone zones. You walk now through a ghost street, one reconstructed from Vacquer's notes and later excavations near Rue Saint-Martin. The ground beneath your feet is compacted, slightly convex at the center, sloping gently towards side gutters.
This cambering is a telltale Roman engineering technique. Embedded in the ground are faint traces of wheel ruts, two parallel lines, barely a centimeter deep, persisting due to centuries of compression. These ruts were discovered in 1935 when a cellar was renovated. The architect who recorded them, Henri Clousseau, remarked that they aligned with no known medieval roots. It was later confirmed in a 1982 study that the ruts matched the width of a Roman cart axle standard known from Lyon and Trier. Thus, beneath Paris's tangled medieval streets lies a lattice of straighter, older ones that determine the city's shape long after the empire faded. Now tension rises once more, tension between theories competing to explain why the Roman footprint shifted, shrank, or morphed. Some historians argue demographic decline after the 3rd century crises caused depopulation of the left bank. Others see administrative relocation to the Ile de la Cité as the primary trigger. A minority even propose climate change as the cause, pointing to cooler, wetter conditions of the late antique Little Ice Age, beginning around 536 CE. But sedimentary data from the Seine contradicts this climate narrative for Lutetia. Flood frequency did not spike correspondingly, and bioarchaeological remains show stable diets well into the 6th century. The strongest evidence favors a political shift rather than an environmental one, the construction of a fortified enclosure on the island around circa 280 to 300 CE. This enclosure, whose foundations still survive beneath the Palais de Justice, signals a strategic decision to concentrate population and governance on more defensible terrain. The left bank was not abandoned, it was de-emphasized.
As the camera sweeps through these reconstructions, the narrator guides you toward another culminating insight. Imagine the city as a palimpsest, not merely layered, but rewritten, scraped, overwritten again. The Romans imposed their order on a Gallic settlement. The medieval clergy reinterpreted Roman ruins as agricultural land. Renaissance builders quarried ancient debris for elegant facades. Osman carved boulevards through entire neighborhoods, unearthing ancient structures only to remove or rebury them. Each era touched the bones of the city with a mix of reverence, indifference, and practicality. And now, the narrator whispers a cinematic transport. What would it feel like to stand in the moment when Roman Lutetia was not a ruin, but a living place? The scene melts into a vivid reconstruction. You appear at dawn on a spring morning in 170 CE. The air smells of damp reeds and warming stone. Market women cross a wooden footbridge connecting the Ile de la Cité to the left bank, carrying baskets of cheese and smoked fish. A barge glides under the bridge, rowed by two men chanting a work rhythm, its hull laden with timber cut upstream. In the distance, the great baths billow pale steam. A group of children chase each other along the edge of a construction yard where new insulae are going up. Their father shouts warnings about sharp tools. The forum hums with energy. Magistrates inscribe announcements on public boards. A vendor arranges imported Samian ware. A Gallic potter displays wares made with local clay from the Bièvre Valley. This, the narrator explains, is the world that lingers beneath Paris, not a ghost city of grand monuments alone, but a texture of daily life, commerce, agriculture, river travel, domestic noise. And because the Romans documented their cities with obsessive detail, fragments of this world still echo: the width of a door threshold, the profile of a drainage pipe, the imprint of a fabric basket on dried clay. You see these things not as ruins, but as fingerprints. Yet the filmic reconstruction dissolves. The dawn of 170 CE fades into a dim vault lit by your lantern once more. The camera moves close to your face as the narrator leans in, quiet, nearly conspiratorial.
It reveals that beneath the modern Paris catacombs, those ossuaries carved in the late 18th century, lie still older quarries, some used since Roman times. In one such quarry, explored during a controlled survey in 1983, archaeologists found pick marks consistent with Roman extraction techniques: shallow, rhythmic, wedge-like cuts used to free limestone blocks without powdering them. These quarries likely supplied stone for Lutetia's monumental buildings. A counterintuitive fact emerges: the Romans did not quarry beneath the city they built.
Rather, medieval and early modern Parisians extended quarry networks so deeply that they intersected earlier Roman workings. The catacombs, then, weave through geological and historical time, conjoining epochs that never meant to meet. The narrator guides you through one such tunnel, a narrow, echoing corridor where your footsteps crack like brittle frost. On one wall is a faint mark, a mason's signature, a looping symbol shaped like an inverted fish. It was found during a 2010 mapping project and resembles signatures at Roman construction sites in Brittany. This suggests skilled laborers migrated between cities, sharing techniques across Gaul. A builder who shaped stones in Lutetia may have once raised walls in Condate, Rennes, or Vorgium, Carahex. The Roman city was part of a network of craft and knowledge, not an isolated frontier. You emerge from the tunnel into a chamber where tree roots dangle from the ceiling like the tendrils of some underground forest. Here, the narrator breathes out a gentle melancholy. These roots, searching for moisture, have pushed their way through centuries of human construction, bridging worlds separated by millennia. Above them stands a cafe, perhaps, or an apartment block. Below them lies the basement of an empire. The narrator reminds you that every layer of Paris is provisional. The Roman city rests atop the Gallic town. The medieval city grew over the Roman. Haussmann's avenues sliced through all of it. The metro burrowed beneath that. The catacombs wound around both, and beneath even those runs the Seine, pulsing with the same rhythm it held when Caesar wrote his terse notes about a small island town resisting Rome. Now, slowly, the narrator circles back to the quiet intimacy of the brand voice. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you are joining me tonight. The echo feels different now, closer, older, as though spoken inside a chamber where voices linger. And so the journey continues. In the comments, let me know which lost aspect of Roman Lutetia you'd most like to see uncovered. Its wooden bridges, its riverside warehouses, its unknown shrines, or perhaps the homes of the Parisii who learned to live with Rome without vanishing into it. Until our next descent, rest gently. Paris will still be here when you wake, and so will the city beneath it.